Hey guys, welcome in. Uh, First off, thanks for stopping by. We're going to talk about something that has kind of crept up in interest to me over the last couple weeks or so. We're going to talk about Unreal Engine and the issues that a lot of people have been bringing up for quite a while. And it's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One is for the longest time, I was a console gamer. I didn't really have to worry about optimization that much for the most part. When console games come out, you download them, you play them, uh, and they play fine. But towards the end of last year, I was able to actually build my first PC. And that's when I kind of started to really understand how tweaking settings can make games run better, uh, especially if you're not running the most high end hardware. The PC that I built is not high end at all. It's what I would consider a pretty mid range PC. It's a 12600K and a 4070 Super. So, like I said, not a real high end system, but not something that you would expect to really struggle to to run a lot of games at medium or high settings. And with that, being somebody that came from playing consoles for 20 plus years, I'm probably going to age myself quite a bit. One of the things that I've been doing is going back and revisiting older games that I had played on console and just wanting to see what the difference was between the experience on console and the experience on PC. Games like Cyberpunk 2077, um, Spider-Man Remastered, and along with that, checking out some newer games that I might not have played on console, but because I have a PC now and I'm able to take advantage of higher frame rates, being able to have better experiences, games like The Finals, Marvel Rivals. And so, one of the things that's been coming up over the last couple weeks is the discussion around Unreal Engine 5 and the optimization for both console and PC. The game that's kind of brought this back to the forefront is Metal Gear Solid Delta and its optimization on both console and PC. Now, this is not an issue that's been exclusive to Metal Gear Solid. It's been a conversation for a while now with games like Stalker 2, games like Avowed, games like Mind's Eye. Of course, Mind's Eye has a whole host of other issues that aren't necessarily exclusive to uh, the engine that it's running on, but it was an Unreal Engine 5 game, and a lot of people pointed to optimization, among other things, as one of the big problems with that game. Other games like Oblivion Remastered, that is an older game that was built on the Creation Engine, I believe. Even back in the day, was not the best running game, but that's the kind of game that you would expect being updated with modern hardware that should be able to run pretty well on mid-range PCs and especially console. And for the most part, it does okay, but it is still a really hard game to run. For the longest time, people have just been chalking it up to it's just not a good engine. It's not well optimized unless you're running, the highest of high end hardware, 4090, 5090, the X3D CPUs. It's just not well optimized. At least that's been the opinion that a lot of people have come to. And to me, that just really sounded like an oversimplification of the problems that Unreal Engine is having. As an analogy, one of my favorite hobbies is playing guitars, right? Now, you can give somebody all the tools that they need to build a great guitar, but if they're not taking advantage of those tools properly, if they're not putting the time in to really understand what they're doing, if they're just kind of rushing through everything, then you're going to get a shit product. It's not going to be a good guitar. That might not be the best analogy, but off the top of my head, it's really the simplest one that I can think of. So to me, it really started to seem like, well, is it really the engine, or is it the developers doing things like taking shortcuts, not using the engine properly to develop their games? And another aspect that I think is really getting lost in all of this is that these developers are developing these games on high end hardware that is really built to kind of get the most out of Unreal Engine with the least amount of effort. So, on that note, Tim Sweeney has responded to a lot of these criticisms of Unreal Engine, which is what we're going to kind of be digging into a little bit here. And I really found his response pretty interesting. So here we have this article from PC Gamer. The headline is Epic CEO Tim Sweeney wades in on the UE performance debate. The primary reason Unreal Engine 5 based games don't run smoothly on certain PCs or GPUs is the development process. And to say, put simply, he's saying that devs need to aim low first, then target higher tier hardware later on. If you scroll down, we can kind of get into some of these quotes. So here we have again, the primary reason Unreal Engine 5 based games don't run smoothly on certain PCs or GPUs is the development process. Down here he says, more specifically, he suggested that one particular problem is the choice of PC platform used in the formative stages of a game's creation. Many developers begin by developing games for high-end hardware, then optimized and test on lower-spec devices in the final stages. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying a second ago, that these developers have access to all of this high-end hardware. You know, they're running 4090s, 5090s, the X3D chips for their tests. They're using these other extreme high-end CPUs for their development processes. And it really does seem like they're coming back later on to try and optimize the games for these lower end systems, you know, systems like mine. Mine is what I would consider mid-range, but some of these games, I would have a really hard time running these games without things like DLSS or FrameGen. And that's where a lot of the community, the PC gaming space, is kind of leaning towards the idea that developers are using DLSS and FrameGen as crutches. Now, I said at the start, one of the reasons this is an interesting topic to me is I've been going back and replaying these games that I played on console originally just to see what the difference is between the experience on console and the experience on PC. For a lot of those games like Spider-Man Remastered, that's been a really good experience. You know, I can run that game at native 1440p with no FrameGen, no DLSS, on high settings, I believe, if not the highest settings, with ray tracing on. And I'm getting, in some areas, upwards of 95 FPS. And in the more condensed areas, I'm getting probably closer to 70 FPS. objectively, that is a better experience than I had on console. The game still looked great on console. It just looks better on PC. Another game that I mentioned going back and replaying is Cyberpunk 2077. I played that on PS5. It was a well, I say great experience. It was a great experience for me at the time, mostly because of the gameplay. You know, if you were to put an FPS counter on that game, is probably close to 30 FPS, maybe 45 FPS without ray tracing on the PS5. Now, obviously, if you put ray tracing on the PS5, that game is going to suffer quite a bit. But on PC, I can run that game with DLSS on quality and ray tracing on and get pretty close to 100 FPS. Now, both of those games were not built on Unreal Engine 5, so it might not be the fairest comparison, but you have to wonder, especially with CD Projekt Red announcing that they're going to be using Unreal Engine 5 for The Witcher 4, I would have to assume that they're going to be using Unreal Engine 5 for the next Cyberpunk project. And as somebody who loved Cyberpunk 2077 and loved it even more when I got to play it on PC, that's a little concerning to me. Now, I kind of have to put a little faith into CD Projekt Red and hope that they're not just going to use their high-end hardware and DLSS and FrameGen as a crutch for developing this game for more mid-range PCs, because to me that would just be completely antithetical to what CD Projekt Red is wanting to do for the gaming community. Now, touching on newer games that do use Unreal Engine 5, Marvel Rivals. I personally have a great experience with Marvel Rivals. I don't get the highest frame rates. You know, I'm somewhere in the 110 to 140 range, depending on what's going on, what map I'm playing on. I do have to use DLSS, but it's not a bad experience. Whereas you see people playing games like Stalker 2, Metal Gear Solid Delta on these high-end systems, and they look okay, but they're not what you would expect from these high-end systems as far as their performance goes. Now, kind of going back to the current reason for people talking about Unreal Engine 5 again, Metal Gear Solid 5, Digital Foundry put out a great video kind of showcasing the differences between the PS5 base and the PS5 Pro, and the results that they got were pretty interesting. The base PS5 actually outperforms the PS5 Pro. Now, it's not by much, it's like single digit frames, but the PS5 Pro is supposed to be not a significant step up from the base PS5, but still a step up from the base PS5. It's got, you know, PlayStation's PSSR, their PlayStation Super Resolution, or whatever it is. But either way, with a new iteration on the hardware, you would expect that Metal Gear Solid 5 runs better on the PS5 Pro than it does on the base PS5, and that's just not the case. And even on PC, people are complaining about the optimization. They're getting stutters, they're getting, you know, these visual artifacts. The game looks great. The graphics look great. But the experience playing the game is where it really struggles. So with all of this in mind, I really have to wonder how these game developers are going to respond to Epic CEO basically calling them out and saying that they're not using the engine properly to develop these games. They're building these games for these high-end systems, and then they're trying to go back and optimize for these lower to mid-range PCs and systems where, in my opinion, and he says the same thing. That really should be where you start the process. You should not be building these games for this high-end hardware and then going back and trying to optimize the games for these lower to mid-tier systems. It's just not going to work. You end up relying on DLSS upscaling and frame gen, and all that does is make the experience worse for the consumer. And you also have to wonder how gamers are going to respond if these games continue to come out unoptimized, what a lot of people would call not ready for release. I mean, at a like there's got to be a breaking point where gamers just refuse to buy these games. So I don't know. It like I said, it's an interesting topic to me. We'll obviously we'll have to see what happens moving forward. Um, but if you have a different opinion on it, feel free to leave a comment. Try not to be too harsh. This is my first like long form, strictly YouTube video. I have other stuff that I'm working on, mostly Let's Plays, kind of going back and revisiting older games that I had played on console to, like I said at the beginning, see what the difference is as far as the experience goes. If you're on Twitch, I do stream every Saturday and Sunday. So come check me out, twitch.tv/Solomatic. There'll be a link in the description. And of course, there'll also be a link to Digital Foundry's video in the description. And I'll leave a link to the PC Gamer article as well. Outside of that, like I said at the beginning, thanks for stopping by. And we'll catch you in the next one.